At a lavish wedding, the groom decided to humiliate the bride by throwing a wedding cake in her face. He expected laughter and a harmless reaction, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The grandeur of the Randolph estate was undeniable. Nestled in the rolling hills outside the city, the mansion was a testament to old money. White stone columns, perfectly manicured gardens, and an air of silent arrogance that permeated the property. Inside, beneath crystal chandeliers and the watchful eyes of long-gone ancestors whose portraits lined the walls, the wedding of the year was about to begin. Jacqueline Morris stood before a massive mirror in the bridal suite, the weight of her wedding gown pressing down on her like an unspoken truth. The dress was exquisite. Ivory satin, fitted bodice, intricate beading that shimmered under the soft light. It was the kind of gown designed for a fairy tale, but Jacqueline knew better than to believe in fairy tales. She had spent too much of her life in boardrooms and negotiations to be swayed by illusions. Her reflection showed a composed woman, her dark skin radiant against the pale fabric, her hair styled to perfection. But beneath that carefully curated exterior, something inside her felt off. She had felt it for months now, an unsettling whisper in the back of her mind, a quiet warning that she had ignored. This marriage was not built on love. Her fiancé, Thomas Randolph, was everything high society deemed desirable. Tall, refined, well-educated, and, most importantly, from a lineage that boasted generations of wealth and influence. But that wealth was waning. The Randolph family, once a dynasty, had been struggling for years, their fortune stretched thin behind an elaborate mask of prosperity. Jacqueline's family, on the other hand, was the embodiment of modern success. The Morris name had become synonymous with innovation, technology, and cutting-edge investments. Her parents, self-made billionaires, had built their empire from nothing, and now they commanded respect in every sphere they entered. For them, this marriage was strategic. Her mother had framed it as an opportunity, a merger of old wealth and new power. Her father, always pragmatic, had assured her that love was secondary to compatibility. Love fades, he had said more than once, but a solid partnership, that lasts. And so Jacqueline had agreed. It wasn't that she despised Thomas. At first, she had even been intrigued by him, his effortless charm, the way he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never had to prove his worth. But as the months passed, that charm revealed cracks. There was something in the way he spoke about people who were different from him. Subtle, cutting remarks that left an aftertaste of disdain. The way he dismissed her work as a hobby, despite the fact that she was one of the youngest and most successful strategists in her field. The way he seemed to believe that by marrying her, he was doing her a favor. She had tried to push those thoughts away. She had reminded herself that marriages like theirs were common in their world, that love was not a prerequisite for success. But today, standing in this room, with the reality of her decision staring back at her, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The knock at the door startled her. Her mother entered first, regal as always, wearing a gown that was only slightly less elaborate than Jacqueline's own. Camille Morris was a woman who commanded attention without effort. Behind her, Jacqueline's father, Edward Morris, stood with his usual composed expression, his sharp eyes assessing his daughter with a quiet intensity. "You look perfect," Camille said, adjusting a stray curl near Jacqueline's temple. "Everything is going exactly as planned." Jacqueline forced a smile. "Of course." Her father stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" It was a loaded question. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. Moments later, she was walking down the grand staircase, every eye in the room turning toward her. Thomas stood at the altar, his expression unreadable. He looked handsome, of course, tailored suit, polished shoes, the very image of sophistication. And yet, when she reached him, when he took her hand in his, there was no warmth. The ceremony was a blur. Vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, polite applause filling the space. They kissed, brief, rehearsed, devoid of passion. And just like that, it was done. Mrs. Jacqueline Randolph. The reception was held in the Randolph estate's sprawling gardens beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. Champagne flowed freely, laughter echoed through the air, and guests flitted from table to table, basking in the spectacle of it all. Jacqueline played her part flawlessly, smiling in all the right places, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. But beneath the surface, she felt like she was watching her own life from a distance. Thomas, on the other hand, thrived. He was in his element, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries with the elite, effortlessly slipping into conversations about politics, finance, and the state of the world. He made no effort to include her. Not that she expected him to. She found herself standing near the fountain, momentarily alone, when she overheard a hushed conversation between two guests, older men, business associates of Thomas's family. "Smart move on his part," one of them said, swirling his whiskey, tying himself to the Morris empire. "That girl's got the kind of money that could keep the Randolph name relevant for another century." The other man chuckled. "He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband, but he's getting an investment." Jacqueline felt something inside her tighten. She turned her gaze back to Thomas, watching as he laughed at something one of his friends said, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of an old flame who had always hovered too close. Her fingers curled around the stem of her champagne flute. Perhaps she had known the truth all along. This wasn't a marriage. It was a business deal, and she was the asset. The thought made her stomach turn. She had always prided herself on being in control, on being the one to dictate the terms. But standing here in the middle of a wedding that was meant to be hers, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone, she realized she had never been in control at all. Not yet. But that was about to change. The Randolph estate glowed under the weight of its own grandeur. From the outside, the wedding reception looked flawless, a seamless blend of tradition, wealth, and status. Beneath a vast canopy of twinkling lights, elite guests moved effortlessly, sipping champagne from crystal flutes, their laughter blending with the soft hum of an orchestral quartet. Jacqueline stood among them, her posture poised, her smile effortless, the perfect image of a woman who belonged in this world. Yet, beneath the surface, something inside her had shifted. She could still hear their voices, the businessmen who had so casually reduced her to an investment. She wasn't naive. She had grown up in a world where wealth dictated alliances, where marriages were often orchestrated for power rather than love. She had accepted that when she agreed to this engagement. But knowing something in theory and experiencing it firsthand were two different things. Thomas had not even looked at her since they arrived at the reception. He thrived among these people, slipping through conversations with an ease that was almost practiced, like an actor delivering his lines on a stage he had walked 1,000 times before. He was perfectly at home, while she stood there, detached, a fixture in a performance designed to uphold the illusion of an unshakable dynasty. "Smile, dear." Her mother's voice was soft, but the command was firm. Camille Morris was a woman who understood the importance of appearances. Her gown, a rich navy blue that accentuated her regal bearing, shimmered under the lights as she stepped beside her daughter. People are watching. Jacqueline forced the corners of her mouth upward, but the smile felt foreign. Camille's eyes flicked briefly toward Thomas, who stood near the bar, speaking animatedly with a group of men. "He's working the room well. That's good. This is what we expected." Expected. That word again. "You should mingle more," Camille continued. "There are important people here tonight." Jacqueline's fingers curled around the stem of her champagne flute. "Important to whom?" Her mother's smile was unwavering. "To you. To your future." Jacqueline exhaled slowly. She knew there was no point in arguing. Camille had spent her life navigating rooms like these, understanding the mechanics of power and influence better than anyone. To her, this was not just a wedding reception. It was the beginning of an empire, a strategic move that would ensure the Morris name held weight in circles even older than money itself. And Jacqueline was the piece that had been played. Across the reception hall, Thomas caught her eye. He raised his glass slightly, a silent toast, a performance for the onlookers. She returned the gesture, the motion automatic, but her stomach twisted at the realization that this was all she could expect from him now. A series of gestures, a partnership on paper, and yet the cracks in his mask were starting to show. She saw it in the way he spoke to her family, the way his politeness felt strained, like an obligation rather than a genuine effort. When he greeted her father, Edward Morris, the handshake was firm but clipped, their exchange brief. Thomas had always been wary of Edward, though he would never admit it aloud. Perhaps because Edward was a self-made man, someone who had built his empire from nothing, while Thomas had inherited a name that meant less and less with each passing year. Or perhaps because Edward saw through him. "You've done well for yourself," Edward said, his tone even, measured. "Your father would be proud." Thomas's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, something unreadable crossing his features before he masked it with an easy smile. "That means a lot," he replied, though his voice carried no sincerity. Jacqueline watched the exchange, noting how Thomas's jaw tightened just slightly before he turned away. She saw it again when he spoke to her younger brother, Malcolm. Malcolm had never liked Thomas. He had been polite, of course, because that was what was expected. But he had always regarded him with a quiet skepticism that bordered on disdain. "You're an interesting man, Randolph," Malcolm said, swirling his drink. "Not the type I pictured my sister with." Thomas's smile was tight. "And what type did you picture?" Malcolm chuckled. "Someone who knows what he's getting into." The tension was palpable. Jacqueline knew her brother well enough to recognize the warning beneath his words. And she knew Thomas well enough to understand that he didn't appreciate being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. His fingers curled slightly at his side, the only outward sign of irritation before he let out a short, calculated laugh and excused himself from the conversation. Jacqueline followed his movements as he walked away, as he downed half his drink in a single swallow before handing off the empty glass to a passing waiter. He was losing control. She had always suspected that his patience was thin, that his temper, though hidden behind polished charm, was volatile. She had seen glimpses of it before, subtle moments when his frustration slipped through the cracks, when his voice sharpened, when his grip tightened. But tonight, the cracks were wider, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something broke. The evening dragged on. She played her part as she had always done, smiling, shaking hands, answering questions about their honeymoon plans, about their shared future, about their aspirations as a newlywed couple. All while Thomas continued his performance, pretending to be the devoted husband, the perfect son-in-law, the charming heir to a crumbling legacy. But she knew him now. She saw the slight downturn of his lips when he thought no one was looking, the flash of irritation when a guest brought up her success rather than his, the tightness in his movements as the evening wore on, as if he were holding something back, something dark and simmering beneath the surface. It was when she overheard him speaking to his friends that everything finally clicked into place. She hadn't meant to listen. She had been passing by, moving through the crowd, when she caught his voice. "Smartest move I've ever made," he was saying, his tone just smug enough to send a chill down her spine. His friends laughed. "You make it sound like a business deal," one of them joked. Thomas shrugged. "That's what marriage is, isn't it?" Jacqueline stopped breathing. She turned her head, just slightly, enough to see him, to see the way he leaned against the bar, relaxed, self-assured, the way he spoke about her as if she were nothing more than a calculated decision. Her stomach turned. She had always known, hadn't she? Deep down, she had known, but hearing it like this, spoken so carelessly, so confidently, shattered any illusions she might have held on to. She wasn't a partner to him. She was a means to an end. And in that moment, something inside her hardened. She was not a woman who let herself be used. And if Thomas thought that this was his victory, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The air inside the Randolph estate was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, rare wines, and the underlying tension that had settled between Jacqueline and Thomas. The night carried on with the smooth elegance expected of an event of this scale. Soft music, practiced laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses as toasts were made in their honor. But for Jacqueline, the carefully curated illusion had begun to crumble. She had spent the last hour moving through the reception, acknowledging guests, nodding at compliments, answering polite but prying questions about their plans as newlyweds. It was all mechanical now. The warmth she had once forced into her expressions had been drained, leaving only the remnants of a practiced performance. Her husband had not spoken to her directly since their staged greeting at the entrance. Not once. She had watched him work the room, his expression perfectly set, his voice carrying just the right mix of charm and intellect. But she had also seen the way he reacted whenever her name was mentioned in conversations he wasn't controlling, a slight downturn of his lips, a flicker of something behind his gaze. She was beginning to understand something fundamental about Thomas. He had never expected to share the spotlight. As the reception wore on, that understanding became more painfully clear. She found herself seated at the head table, surrounded by key members of both families, as the conversation took an inevitable turn toward the topic of finances. Jacqueline had anticipated this. The Morris name was synonymous with wealth. New wealth, but wealth nonetheless. Her family had built their empire from the ground up, securing dominance in both the technology and art worlds. The Randolphs, on the other hand, were a name that once commanded power, now clinging desperately to its former prestige. And Thomas, in his mind, had made the smartest move possible. He had married into the future. But what he had not anticipated was that the Morris family did not give freely. "My wife and I were discussing earlier how beautifully this evening came together," one of Thomas's uncles was saying, swirling his drink. "A grand affair. I imagine it cost a small fortune to orchestrate something of this scale." Jacqueline felt it before she saw it. The slight stiffening in Thomas's shoulders, the tension in the air around him. She knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting for someone, preferably her father, to confirm what he had always assumed, that the Morris family had footed the bill for this spectacle, that this night was yet another generous contribution from his wife's bottomless resources. Edward Morris, however, was a man who did not cater to assumption. "Well," he said, taking a measured sip of his whiskey, "we made sure that the financial responsibilities were split fairly. This was, after all, a union of equals." The words were smooth, deliberate, and they landed like a hammer against glass. Jacqueline did not have to look at Thomas to know he was fuming. She could feel it radiating off of him, the quiet fury beneath his carefully composed exterior. For months, he had been operating under the belief that marriage to her would grant him unrestricted access to the Morris wealth, that whatever financial struggles his family faced would be swiftly alleviated by his new position. This was not the first time Jacqueline had sensed this entitlement in him. There had been small signs along the way, subtle comments about how well off she was, jokes that weren't really jokes about how lucky he was to have found a wife who would never have to worry about a thing. And then, more recently, the offhanded remarks about her work, about how, with the kind of money she had, she didn't need to dedicate so much time to her career. He had assumed that, as his wife, she would exist as an extension of his ambitions, that her wealth was simply an unspoken dowry, something to be merged seamlessly into his own assets. Now, with the reality sinking in, that the Morris family did not hand out blank checks even to their own blood, Jacqueline knew he was seething. He recovered quickly. "Of course," he said smoothly, his lips curling into a facsimile of a smile. "A partnership. That was always the intention." But she heard it, the sharp edge beneath his words. He was furious. The rest of the table had moved on, but Jacqueline remained hyper-aware of the man sitting beside her, of the way he clenched and unclenched his jaw, his fingers drumming absently against the pristine white tablecloth. For the first time that evening, she felt something close to satisfaction. After the dinner portion of the reception concluded, the guests were encouraged to move freely throughout the estate, enjoying the various entertainment sections set up for the evening. Some gathered by the open bar, others ventured out onto the grand balcony where a second orchestra played beneath the starlit sky. Jacqueline made her way toward the gardens, needing space to think. She had barely stepped onto the stone pathway when she heard footsteps behind her. Thomas. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. He fell into step beside her, silent for a few moments, his hands tucked into his pockets. Then, quietly, but with the unmistakable undertone of restrained anger, he said, "I didn't realize your family was so calculating." Jacqueline inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "Splitting costs fairly, a union of equals." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's an interesting way of putting it." She knew what he meant. He wasn't angry at the money itself. He was angry at what it symbolized. By refusing to bankroll the wedding entirely, her family had made a statement. They were not handing him a key to the vault. Jacqueline turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. His usual mask of charm was gone, replaced by something colder. He had spent his life believing he was superior to people like her. And yet, here he was, depending on her. She saw the humiliation in his eyes, and she knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was not a partnership. This was a war. A quiet war waged through sharp words and veiled threats. And the first battle had just been won. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Thomas returned to his performance, laughing with guests, making himself the center of attention once again. But Jacqueline saw through it now. She saw the cracks, the resentment simmering beneath his skin. She should have felt uneasy, but instead she felt something else. Power. Because for the first time since this engagement had been arranged, she was the one with the upper hand. Thomas had believed he was marrying into wealth, but he had underestimated her. And tonight, he had realized his mistake. The air inside the Randolph estate was still thick with the weight of the evening's revelations. The carefully constructed image of the perfect wedding remained intact for the outside world, but beneath it, tensions simmered, invisible yet palpable to those who knew where to look. Jacqueline moved through the reception hall with the same poised grace she had maintained throughout the night. She had spent years perfecting this ability, the art of appearing unshaken, of smiling even when she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. But she wasn't just smiling anymore. She was watching Thomas as he entertained guests, his movements practiced, his tone smooth, watching the way his fingers tightened subtly around his champagne flute when certain topics arose. Conversations about business, about financial stability, about partnerships. He had not spoken to her directly since their encounter in the garden. She knew why. He was calculating, weighing his options, considering his next move. And Jacqueline? She was waiting. She knew him now, knew how his mind worked. He was a man who had been raised on the belief that he was superior, not because he had built anything himself, but because of the legacy he carried. But tonight, that legacy had been exposed for what it was, a facade. And she had seen the look in his eyes when he realized that she was not going to be his lifeline. That look had been dangerous. The kind of look a man like Thomas wore when he felt powerless, and powerless men often sought ways to regain control. It was during the first dance of the evening that the shift became undeniable. The orchestra played a slow, sweeping melody as the floor cleared for the bride and groom. Jacqueline felt Thomas's hand on the small of her back as he led her into the dance, their movements perfectly in sync for the eyes that watched. But she could feel it, the tension in his grip, the way his fingers pressed just a fraction too hard against her waist, as if reminding her of something. "You've been quiet," he murmured, his voice low, measured. "So have you," she replied, her tone light, unaffected. His lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but there was nothing warm about it. The dance continued, each step a silent conversation. She had once imagined what their wedding dance would feel like. She had thought that perhaps, if nothing else, there would be a moment, just one, where she could forget everything else and believe, if only for a second, that this was real. But there was no warmth in the way he held her, no tenderness in the way he guided her across the floor. There was only calculation and resentment. When the dance ended, Jacqueline excused herself, needing a moment away from the growing intensity of the evening. She made her way toward the grand staircase, seeking a reprieve from the eyes and expectations surrounding her. And then she heard them. Voices. Male voices, low and amused, carrying from just beyond the arched doorway that led to the cigar lounge, one of the many spaces reserved for the elite men of the Randolph social circle. She might have kept walking, but then she heard her name. "Smartest move I ever made," Thomas's voice drawled, carrying just enough arrogance to send a chill through her veins. The response came in laughter, deep, knowing chuckles from men who understood exactly what he meant. "You say that like it was difficult," one of them teased. "Come on, Randolph, we all saw it. She's the prize of the century. Jacqueline's breath stilled. "She's an investment," Thomas corrected smoothly, "the kind that pays off in the long run." Another ripple of laughter. She felt something inside her go quiet. Not anger, not even betrayal. Just cold, clear understanding. She had suspected, of course, had known in some unspoken way that this marriage had never been about love. But hearing him say it so plainly, so openly, without hesitation or shame, that was something else entirely. She should have walked away then, should have let it go, let him bask in his own self-importance, let him think he had won whatever game he was playing. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked straight through the arched doorway. The conversation halted instantly. Thomas, lounging in a high-backed leather chair, looked up, his smirk frozen in place as the air in the room shifted. The other men exchanged glances, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Jacqueline held his gaze, stepping further into the room, her expression unreadable. "Don't stop on my account," she said lightly. It sounded like a fascinating discussion. Thomas's fingers curled around the armrest of his chair. A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance perhaps, or irritation at being interrupted, or caught. "Jacqueline," he said smoothly, "I was just calling me an investment," she finished for him, her voice even. A beat of silence. One of the men cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. Jacqueline took another step closer. It was the first time since the ceremony that she had truly looked at him, and now she saw him for exactly what he was. A man who thought he had won. A man who had spent his life believing that his name alone made him untouchable. But she was Jacqueline Morris. She had built herself on more than just a name, and Thomas had just made a very serious mistake. The moment passed, and Jacqueline let it. She didn't need to say anything more. She had seen what she needed to see. So she turned, walked away, and let the weight of her silence settle in her wake. By the time she returned to the reception hall, the celebration was in full swing. The guests were laughing, drinking, dancing, oblivious to the fracture that had formed beneath the surface of the evening. Jacqueline moved through the crowd, pausing only when she felt a familiar presence at her side. Her brother, Malcolm. "You good?" he asked, his voice quiet but knowing. She exhaled slowly. "I will be." She glanced across the room, finding Thomas exactly where she knew he would be, among the people who still believed in his mask, who still thought he was what he pretended to be. He hadn't looked at her since she left the cigar lounge. And she knew why. Because he knew. For the first time in his life, Thomas Randolph had realized that he was not the one in control. Not anymore. And Jacqueline? She was just getting started. The reception had reached its crescendo. The laughter was louder, the conversations more animated, and the champagne flowed freely as the evening stretched into the late hours. But beneath the grand spectacle of wealth and tradition, Jacqueline felt something shifting, something inevitable, like a storm gathering on the horizon. She had seen Thomas unraveling, had felt the way his mask had begun to crack ever since the moment her father made it clear that he would not be the financial lifeline he had counted on. She had watched his frustration simmer beneath the surface, seen the way his grip had tightened during their dance, the way his words had sharpened when he spoke to her in the garden. And now she could sense it, the moment when that carefully controlled resentment would spill over. She stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by guests who still believed in the illusion, waiting for the next grand moment of the evening. The wedding cake, a towering masterpiece of white and gold, had been wheeled out onto the main stage, gleaming under the soft lighting. The cake cutting was a tradition, a symbolic gesture of unity, of the first act a couple performed together as husband and wife. Jacqueline had once imagined this moment differently, but then again, she had once imagined a great many things differently. She moved toward the cake as the guests turned their attention to the couple of the hour. Thomas was already there, waiting, a practiced smile on his lips. But she saw through it now. He was still fuming from their last encounter. Still stewing over the fact that she had humiliated him, first by denying him the financial access he had expected, and then by catching him in the act of openly demeaning her. He was a man who had always believed he was above consequence. But tonight, he had been reminded that even a Randolph could fall. She stepped beside him, careful not to let their bodies touch. The cameras were trained on them, their every move documented, immortalized. A silver knife was placed in her hand. Thomas reached for it as well, his fingers brushing against hers. The weight of the blade between them felt heavier than it should have. They cut through the first layer together, a clean, precise motion. The applause was polite, the flashes of cameras bright. And then came the part everyone was waiting for. The tradition where the newlyweds fed each other the first bite. Jacqueline hesitated only for a fraction of a second. She took a small piece, carefully balancing it on her fork before lifting it toward his lips. Thomas held her gaze as he accepted it, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he chewed. And then it was his turn. She knew what was coming before it happened, knew it from the way he took a much larger piece than necessary, knew it from the way his grip on the cake tightened just slightly. And in that brief, fleeting moment, she could see it. His anger, his bruised ego, his need to reclaim power in whatever small way he could. She saw it coming, but she didn't move, because some things needed to be seen. With a swift, deliberate motion, Thomas lifted a piece of cake and shoved it directly into her face. The room fell silent. For a moment, it was as if time itself had frozen. The thick, sugary frosting smeared across her cheek, her lips, her eyelashes. The cream coated her skin, dripping down onto the delicate lace of her gown. A few guests let out nervous laughs, unsure if this was meant to be a part of the show, but Jacqueline wasn't laughing. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of what he had just done settle into the air. Thomas had expected laughter. He had expected that people would brush it off, that she would play along, that she would smile and wipe it away as if it had all been a harmless joke. But Jacqueline Morris was not a woman who tolerated being made a fool of. And tonight, Thomas Randolph had finally overplayed his hand. The whispers began almost immediately. Jacqueline could hear them, soft and sharp like the rustling of fabric in an otherwise quiet room. Did that just happen? He just threw that cake right in her face. That wasn't playful. That was... The sound of someone's glass being hastily set down punctuated the murmurs. Her father had stood up. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her mother press a hand against his arm, stopping him before he could take a step forward. Not yet. Not here. Jacqueline inhaled slowly, reaching for the napkin that had been left on the table beside her. She wiped the frosting from her cheek in a slow, deliberate motion, her fingers steady. She met Thomas's gaze, and for the first time that night, she saw something new in his eyes. Doubt. Uncertainty. A flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong move. She let the silence stretch just a moment longer, ensuring that everyone in the room felt it. Then, with quiet, devastating clarity, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception did not recover. Not really. People tried to pretend, of course. The band resumed playing, the waitstaff continued serving, the guests attempted to shift their focus back to their drinks and their conversations. But the energy had changed. The illusion had cracked. Jacqueline did not return to the ballroom. Instead, she retreated to the private bridal suite upstairs, where she peeled the soiled fabric of her wedding gown away from her body, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. A woman covered in remnants of what should have been a celebration. A woman who had allowed herself to believe, for a time, that she could navigate this marriage on her own terms. She should have known better. There was no salvaging this. She had given Thomas every opportunity to prove that there was something in him worth trusting, and he had just proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was not. A knock sounded at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. Her mother entered, followed closely by her father. Camille's expression was unreadable, though Jacqueline could see the sharpness in her eyes, the kind of sharpness that only emerged when something truly unforgivable had occurred. Edward, however, looked ready to tear through walls. "Darling," Camille said carefully, "you don't have to make any decisions tonight." But Jacqueline already had. She met her mother's gaze through the mirror. "This is over." And for the first time that evening, she felt something close to relief, because she had been waiting for a reason. And now she had one. The final, undeniable confirmation that she would never, could never, spend her life with a man like Thomas Randolph. She had once believed that she could bend the terms of this marriage to suit her, that she could outmaneuver him, control the pieces in a way that ensured her own power. But power meant nothing if she allowed herself to be degraded. And Jacqueline Morris did not belong to anyone. By the time the night was over, Thomas would know that. And by the time the world woke up tomorrow, they would all know it too. The weight of the frosting still clung to Jacqueline's skin even after she had wiped most of it away. The fabric of her gown, once pristine, bore the evidence of the humiliation she had endured in front of hundreds of guests. She had always been composed, always controlled, but this was something different. This was a line crossed, an unspoken declaration from Thomas that she was not his equal, but his possession, something to be put in her place when she dared to challenge him. The room was still spinning with conversation as she walked away. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate, each movement an act of defiance. People whispered, their voices hushed but frantic, unsure whether to laugh off what had happened or acknowledge the sheer audacity of it. Some guests had already started discreetly gathering their things, their expressions tense, understanding that they had just witnessed the unraveling of something far more significant than a wedding tradition gone wrong. Behind her, Thomas remained standing by the cake, his smirk faltering as the weight of the silence around him became unbearable. He had expected a reaction, but not this. He had expected her to play along, to giggle, to wipe the frosting off her face with a playful shrug, to let the night continue as though nothing had happened. But Jacqueline had done none of those things. She had not yelled, had not thrown the cake back at him, had not caused a scene. Instead, she had left, and in doing so, she had let the silence speak for itself. She walked past waiters frozen in place, past guests who quickly averted their eyes, past members of her family who watched her movements with a quiet, burning anger. Camille and Edward Morris stood at a distance, their expressions unreadable, but their presence unmistakably powerful. She could see the way her father's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the barely restrained fury rolling off him in waves. If her mother had not placed a hand on his arm, Edward would have already been striding across the room to make Thomas regret every decision that had led to this moment. Malcolm was the first to move. Her brother had been sitting at a nearby table, and the second Jacqueline turned away from Thomas, he was on his feet, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable except for the fire in his eyes. She didn't say anything as she passed him, and he didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. The grand staircase leading up to the bridal suite felt longer than it had earlier in the evening. She climbed each step with slow, measured grace, knowing full well that every eye in the room was still on her, that every guest was waiting to see what would happen next. They wanted drama, spectacle, a confrontation that would turn this into something they could gossip about for years. But she would give them none of it. The doors to the suite closed behind her with a finality that felt like the turning of a page. The room was silent, untouched by the chaos below. The laughter and music from the reception hall were muffled, distant, as though they belonged to a different world entirely. Jacqueline crossed the room with purpose, moving toward the vanity where a silver-framed mirror reflected her image back at her. The woman staring back at her was no longer a bride. She was something else entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the edge of the vanity, gripping it to steady herself. Not out of fear, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer force of what she was holding back. The weight of everything that had led her to this moment, the months of doubt, the quiet humiliations, the realization that she had let herself be talked into believing that this marriage was something she could control. She had been wrong. The sound of a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't respond immediately, but the door opened anyway. Her mother entered first, moving with the same effortless poise she always carried. Camille's gown shimmered under the soft lighting, her expression composed, but her eyes held a quiet rage. Edward followed, closing the door behind them, his presence filling the room with unspoken fury. Neither of them spoke at first. Camille was the one to break the silence. "You don't have to go back down there." Jacqueline met her mother's gaze through the mirror, seeing not just concern but something deeper. This was not just about the cake. This was about everything that had led up to this night, about the warnings she had chosen to ignore, about the choices she had made believing she could handle a man like Thomas Randolph. Edward exhaled sharply, pacing to the side of the room, running a hand over his jaw as though trying to contain his anger. Jacqueline had seen her father furious before, but never like this. Never with a rage so quiet, so controlled, so dangerous. She turned to face them fully. "This is over." Her mother didn't flinch. Edward stopped pacing. Camille inclined her head slightly, her eyes searching her daughter's face for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that Jacqueline might waver. She found none. "Good," her father said, his voice like steel, "because if you weren't walking away from this, I would have dragged you out myself." Jacqueline let out a slow breath, some of the tension in her shoulders easing. Her mother reached for her hands, squeezing them gently. "You don't have to make a statement tonight," Camille said carefully. "But tomorrow, when the world wakes up, they need to know exactly where you stand." And they would. There would be no carefully worded PR statements, no attempts to spin this into something salvageable. She would not be the woman who stayed. She would not be the wife who tolerated disrespect. She would be the woman who walked away. The knock at the door this time was different, sharper, more urgent. Edward opened it before Jacqueline could respond, revealing Malcolm standing there, his expression dark. He's coming up here." The room tensed. Camille let out a soft, tired sigh as though she had expected this but had hoped for a little more time. Edward's jaw locked. Jacqueline didn't need to ask who he meant. Of course Thomas would come, because this was what men like him did. They pushed boundaries, they tested limits, they demanded explanations when things didn't go their way. And tonight, he was about to learn that Jacqueline was done giving him any. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing the fabric of her gown where the remnants of the cake still clung. Then, with the same effortless poise her mother had carried all her life, she turned toward the door. Let him in. Malcolm hesitated. Her father tensed. But Jacqueline had already made her decision. If Thomas thought this night wasn't over yet, he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Because this wasn't just about what had happened at the reception. This wasn't just about the cake. This was about power. And tonight, for the first time in his life, Thomas Randolph was about to understand what it felt like to lose it. The door opened before Thomas even had the chance to knock. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside the bridal suite, his polished shoes sinking into the plush carpet. The room smelled of vanilla and orchids, a stark contrast to the heavy scent of whiskey and cigars that clung to him from the reception hall below. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the sight before him. Jacqueline standing in the center, her gown still stained with the remnants of the cake he had shoved into her face, her expression unreadable. Her mother, Camille, stood to her right, silent but imposing, while her father, Edward, was positioned closer to the door, a physical barrier between Thomas and the only exit. And then there was Malcolm, leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, his stare a quiet warning. Thomas had always been good at maintaining control of a room, but this was not his domain. He had come expecting anger, perhaps even tears, but instead he was met with something far worse. Silence. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile onto his face. "I came to talk." Jacqueline didn't move, didn't even blink. She just stood there, her posture unnervingly steady. The silence stretched between them, thick, unbreakable. He had expected her to lash out, to confront him in front of her family, to give him something he could twist, something he could turn back on her. But she gave him nothing. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Are you really going to do this?" His voice was low, just a fraction above a whisper, but in the quiet of the room, it felt deafening. Walk away from this marriage over a joke? Still nothing. His jaw tightened, his composure slipping. "This is ridiculous, Jacqueline. It was just a bit of cake. I was playing along with tradition. Everyone laughed." "No one laughed." Her voice was steady, cold, the first words she had spoken to him since the moment she had walked away downstairs. And they landed like a blade against his pride. His nostrils flared slightly, his frustration mounting. "So, that's it then? You're going to humiliate me in front of everyone, make a spectacle out of this over nothing?" Her father shifted his stance, his presence an unspoken warning, but Jacqueline didn't need protection. She had already won. She had won the moment she had refused to engage, the moment she had stripped him of the reaction he had been counting on. Finally, she moved. Just a step closer, just enough to tilt her head slightly as she regarded him with something that was almost pity. "This was never going to work," she said softly, and the certainty in her voice made something inside him tighten, something he wasn't used to feeling. He had expected control. He had expected to be the one dictating the terms, to be the one making the decisions. He had never expected to lose. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a woman who had already made up her mind. He let out a sharp exhale, his mask slipping for the briefest moment before he forced himself to smirk. So, what now? You think you can just walk away? The world doesn't work like that, Jacqueline. People don't just get to rewrite the rules when they don't like them. She smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile he had ever seen from her before. It wasn't warm, wasn't charming, wasn't meant to soothe or comfort. It was a smile of certainty, of quiet, unwavering power. I already have. And that was it. That was the end. Thomas stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for someone to tell him this wasn't real, that she was bluffing, that this was just a momentary lapse in judgment. But no one did, because everyone in that room knew the truth. Jacqueline Morris was done. He turned on his heel and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, the silence swallowing the space he had occupied just moments before. Her mother exhaled slowly, her eyes filled with something unreadable. Her father nodded once, as if confirming what he had always known. Malcolm smirked slightly, as though unsurprised that Thomas had left without putting up more of a fight. Jacqueline felt the tension drain from her shoulders. It was over. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, she felt free. The sound of the door closing behind Thomas was final. Jacqueline stood in the center of the room, the weight of the night pressing down on her, but not in the way she had expected. She had imagined this moment before, long before she had ever walked down the aisle, before she had ever let herself be pulled into the illusion of control. She had pictured herself breaking away from him eventually, but she had not expected it to happen like this. Not so suddenly, not so completely. And yet, as the silence stretched through the bridal suite, there was no doubt in her mind. Her mother was the first to move, stepping toward her with the same quiet grace she had carried her entire life. Camille Morris had never been one to raise her voice, never been one to act impulsively. She had been watching Jacqueline closely all night, waiting, knowing this moment would come. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face, her fingers briefly ghosting over the remnants of cake that still clung to her skin. "We'll take care of everything," Camille said, her voice smooth, assured. There was no hesitation in her words, no concern about what came next, because she had always known how this would end. She had seen it long before Jacqueline had been willing to admit it. Her father, Edward, remained near the door, his hands still in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But Jacqueline knew him well enough to understand the depth of his fury. He had restrained himself tonight, held back from doing what every instinct in him had told him to do. If Thomas had been anyone else, if they had been anywhere else, there would have been no conversation, no confrontation behind closed doors. Edward would have handled things in a way that left no room for discussion. But this was not about impulsivity. This was about something far greater than a moment of anger. Jacqueline took a slow breath, feeling the exhaustion creeping into her bones. "I want it done by morning," she said simply. Camille's lips twitched slightly, the closest she ever came to showing amusement. "Of course." Malcolm let out a soft laugh from where he leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest. "Thomas is going to wake up tomorrow to find out his entire life fell apart while he was sleeping." Jacqueline met her brother's gaze. "That's the least he deserves." She turned toward the mirror once more, her reflection fractured by the events of the evening. She had walked into this marriage believing she could play by the rules, believing she could shape the terms to fit her, that she could mold the situation into something she could control. But control had never been in her grasp, not in the way she had thought. Thomas had believed he held the power, had believed she would be like so many other women before her, silent, compliant, willing to tolerate humiliation for the sake of appearances. He had thought he could diminish her, that he could push her into submission. He had never been more wrong. She stepped away from the mirror and turned to her father. "Make the calls." Edward nodded once. "It's already being handled." Jacqueline knew what that meant. Her father had not been waiting for her to make a decision. He had already put things in motion the moment she walked away from the cake table, the moment she had made it clear that this marriage would not continue. Camille had always been the face of their family, but Edward had been the force behind it. By the time Thomas even realized what was happening, it would be too late. She moved toward the wardrobe in the far corner of the suite, pulling open the doors. Inside hung the outfits she had brought for the honeymoon that would never happen. Designer pieces carefully curated for a life she would not be living. Without hesitation, she pulled the gown from her body, letting it fall to the floor in a heap of ruined silk and lace. She reached for something else, something simple, comfortable, an outfit that belonged to her, not to the illusion of the woman she had been expected to become. She dressed quickly, each movement precise, methodical. Her mother watched her without comment, though Jacqueline could feel the approval radiating from her. When she was finished, she turned back to them. "I want to be gone before he realizes." Her father checked his watch. "We have an hour, maybe less." That was enough. She didn't need to see the aftermath. She didn't need to watch as Thomas realized that the world he had so carefully constructed for himself had collapsed overnight. By the time he opened his eyes in the morning, the news would already be circulating. The engagement was broken. The marriage was annulled before it had even begun. His business connections, the ones that had already begun to waver, would pull away completely. His name, which had once carried weight, would now be attached to the image of a man who had lost everything in a single night. There would be no recovery from this. Jacqueline had no doubt that Thomas would try. He would fight, he would rage, he would attempt to regain control in whatever way he could. But it wouldn't matter, because he had underestimated her. And that was a mistake no one survived twice. She moved towards the door, her mother and brother following closely behind. Edward was already on the phone, his voice low and even as he finalized the details. Jacqueline didn't look back. She had nothing left to see. As they stepped into the elevator, Camille finally spoke again. "Where do you want to go?" Jacqueline considered the question for only a moment before exhaling. "Anywhere but here." Her mother nodded. "Then that's where we'll go." As the elevator doors closed, Jacqueline felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more. Watch our other videos for more compelling stories and share this video with someone who might find it interesting. See you next time.